November 8, 1943, Salerno, Italy. Cold rain. Major Duncan Blackwood stood in the mud and stared at the mountain 2 miles away. He could see the bunkers, dark slots carved into grey stone, machine gun positions that commanded every approach. Artillery craters pocked the valley floor like the surface of a dead moon. Smoke still rose from yesterday's failed assault. The British had tried. 847 casualties in 3 days. The Americans had sent tanks, 12 burning hulls now rusted in the minefields. The Poles had charged twice. Both times they came back carrying their wounded. This fortress blocked the Allied advance to Rome. 150,000 troops sat in the rain, waiting for someone to break through, waiting for the impossible. Defending that mountain was Major Dietrich von Steinberg. 340 Germans, 1st Parachute Division. They had survived Africa. They had survived Sicily. They had not lost a defensive position since Tobruk fell 2 years ago. The Germans expected British tactics. Methodical artillery preparation followed by infantry assault. They expected American power, tanks and overwhelming firepower. They understood these patterns. They had counters for every move the Allies had shown them. They did not expect patience. What happened over the next 18 months became legend. The Germans would give the Canadians a name. Die Verfluchten, the cursed ones. Not because they were cruel, not because they were brutal, but because they were everywhere. Because they appeared on ridgelines that should have been impossible to reach. Because they returned to positions after being shelled out. Because they never retreated the way German commanders expected. This is that story. Blackwood was 38 years old. He had been in Italy for exactly 4 days. His uniform was still new enough that it chafed at the collar. His boots had not yet molded to his feet. But his eyes, those eyes that now scanned the Gothic Line's approaches, those eyes had been hunting since he was 12 years old in the Scottish Highlands. He did not see a mountain, he saw terrain. The 5th Canadian Armoured Division had landed at Salerno on November 4th, 12,400 men. The smallest Allied division in Italy. The British fielded 18,000 per division, the Americans even more. The Canadians were supposed to be a supporting force, colonial auxiliaries, reinforcements for the real armies. That misconception would not survive first contact. Behind Blackwood, his command tank idled, a Sherman M4A1, 30 tons of American steel, reliable, predictable. The Germans had faced hundreds of them. They knew the Sherman's weaknesses. Thin armor, a 75mm gun that could not penetrate a Panther's front plate, a tendency to catch fire when hit. The Germans called them Ronsons, lights every time. But the Germans had not yet faced Duncan Blackwood inside a Sherman. "Sir?" Captain Elias Thornhill appeared beside him, 29 years old, face weathered from 5 years as a forest ranger in Manitoba. He moved silently, even in full gear. Blackwood had not heard him approach. "Captain, British pulled back again, lost another company this morning." Blackwood nodded. He had watched it happen through binoculars. The British infantry had advanced along the creek bed, textbook flanking maneuver, except the Germans had seen it coming from 3 miles away. Pre-registered artillery had torn the attack apart before it reached the base of the slope. How many? 43 casualties, 7 confirmed dead. Numbers, always numbers. But behind every number was a family. A mother who would receive a telegram. A wife who would never see her husband walk through the door again. Children who would grow up with photographs instead of fathers. Blackwood pulled out his map. It was covered in pencil marks. Elevation lines, approach routes that other officers had tried, red X marks where attacks had failed. The pattern was clear. Every Allied assault had gone exactly where the Germans expected. "What do you see?" Thornhill asked. It was a good question. Blackwood had learned long ago that terrain told stories if you knew how to read it. In the Highlands, he had tracked red deer through country that tourists swore was impassable. He had learned that animals did not follow human logic. They did not take the obvious path. They found the gaps, the hidden draws, the places where the wind masked their scent and the ground cover concealed their movement. "I see a kill zone," Blackwood said. "Every approach is covered. Interlocking fields of fire, artillery pre-sighted, minefields on the obvious routes. "So how do we get through?" Blackwood did not answer immediately. He traced his finger along the map, past the main valley, past the ridgelines where the British had bled. His finger stopped on a section of terrain marked with tight contour lines and a symbol for olive groves. "We don't go through, we go around." Thornhill leaned closer. "That's marked impassable for armour, sir." "It's marked impassable because staff officers in Naples think tanks only drive on roads." "Can a Sherman make it through an olive grove?" "I don't know, but I know deer can climb mountains that tourists think are cliffs. I know wolves can move through forest without making a sound. I know predators survive by not being where prey expects them." Thornhill was quiet for a moment. Then he smiled. It was not a happy smile. It was the smile of a man who had just realized his commanding officer was either brilliant or insane, possibly both. "We're not the British," Blackwood said. "We're not the Americans. We don't have to fight their war." That night, Blackwood sat in his tent and wrote a letter home to Isabel, his wife. 22 years married, 2 children grown, a stone cottage in Cairngorms that seemed impossibly far away now. "Dearest Isabel," he wrote, "Italy is not like Scotland, but the principles are the same. Patience, observation, understanding terrain better than your enemy does. I think often of the stag we tracked for 3 days in the autumn of '38. Remember how we found him? Not by following where he had been, but by understanding where he would go. War is not so different." He did not tell her about the British casualties. He did not describe the burned-out tanks or the smell of cordite that never quite left his uniform. He did not mention that the mountain ahead had already killed more men than his entire regiment contained. Some things a soldier kept to himself. 20 miles north, in a bunker carved into living rock, Major Dietrich von Steinberg studied his own maps. He was 43 years old, a professor of military history at Heidelberg before the war. He had written papers on defensive doctrine. He had studied every major siege from Alexander to Napoleon. Then the war came and turned theory into practice. Africa had been his education. The desert taught harsh lessons about logistics and movement, about the value of position over numbers. He had watched Rommel turn inferior forces into victory through superior placement and timing. When Italy came, von Steinberg applied those lessons to mountainous terrain. The result was the Gothic line. Herr Major, Hauptmann Lucas Bergmann entered the bunker. 36 years old, thin face, sharp eyes. Before the war, he had been a journalist for Berliner Zeitung. Now he was von Steinberg's second in command. He kept a diary. Every day, without fail, he recorded what he saw. Not propaganda, just observations. The truth as he experienced it. "The British pulled back again," Bergman said. "I saw. That makes 3 failed attempts in 5 days." Von Steinberg nodded. He felt no joy in the British casualties, only a professional satisfaction that his defensive calculations had proven correct. The Gothic line was mathematically sound. Interlocking fields of fire, artillery support from positions the enemy could not reach, supply lines protected by terrain, a fortress built not with men, but with geometry. "What do you know about these Canadians?" von Steinberg asked. Bergman consulted his notes. 5th Armoured Division, arrived 4 days ago, approximately 12,000 men, Sherman tanks, standard Allied equipment. They are listed as a supporting unit. Supporting, von Steinberg tasted the word. Colonial auxiliaries. That is the assessment, yes. Von Steinberg was not so certain. He had learned in Africa to never underestimate an enemy. But the reports suggested nothing unusual. The Canadians were equipped like the Americans, organized like the British. On paper, they appeared to be exactly what the intelligence summaries claimed. A second-rate unit filling gaps in the Allied line. Have they attempted any attacks? Not yet, Herr Major. They appear to be conducting reconnaissance. For how long? 3 days now, continuous patrols, very thorough. 3 days of reconnaissance. That was longer than the Americans typically waited, longer than the British. Von Steinberg made a note. Patience could indicate caution, or it could indicate preparation. "Monitor them closely," he said. "I want reports on any unusual activity." "Jawohl, Herr Major." That night, Bergmann wrote in his diary by candlelight. November 8th, 1943. New arrivals from Allied lines, maroon patches on their shoulders. Canadians, we are told. Colonial troops from the British Empire. Not concerning. They are few in number and poorly positioned. The mountain is ours. It will remain ours. The Allies break themselves against our positions like waves against rock. These Canadians will be no different. He was wrong about that. The next 6 months passed in a blur of small engagements. The Canadians probed, they patrolled, they mapped German positions with a thoroughness that bordered on obsession. Lieutenant Margaret Donnelly, the division's medical officer and intelligence specialist, spent her nights creating detailed charts of German defensive positions, guard rotation schedules, artillery patterns, supply convoy routes. She was 25 years old, a schoolteacher from Ontario before the war. Now she studied the enemy the way she had once studied lesson plans, with meticulous attention to detail. "They rotate their guards every 4 hours, she told Blackwood in March of 1944. "But there's a gap, 3:18 to 3:23 in the morning, 5 minutes when the outgoing sentries have left, but the incoming ones haven't reached their positions yet." 5 minutes, Blackwood repeated. 5 minutes when they're vulnerable. Blackwood looked at her map. Red lines marked German positions. Blue lines showed potential Canadian approaches. The gap she had identified was tiny. A crack in the fortress. But cracks could widen. "Good work, Lieutenant." She nodded. She did not smile. She had seen too many wounded come through her aid station to take satisfaction in planning attacks. But she understood the necessity. Every German position they neutralized meant fewer Allied casualties later. Winter turned to spring. The rain stopped. The mud dried. And in May of 1944, the Allied command ordered a major offensive against the Hitler Line, a massive fortification that ran across the Liri Valley, the last major barrier before Rome. The British would attack on the left, the Americans on the right, and the Canadians, those colonial auxiliaries, those supporting units, would take the center. Major Blackwood received his orders on May 20th. "You are to conduct a diversionary attack," the British general told him. The general was 48, greying hair, a voice that suggested he had been explaining obvious things to dim subordinates his entire career. "Draw German attention while the Americans make the main thrust." "Diversionary," Blackwood repeated. "Yes, demonstrate against their positions, make noise, keep them occupied. And if we break through?" The general looked at Blackwood as if he had suggested the moon was made of cheese. "Major, the Hitler Line has stopped every attack for 6 months. The Americans will employ overwhelming firepower. You are to support them, not to attempt anything foolish." Blackwood said nothing. He had learned in the Highlands that sometimes the best response to foolishness was silence. That night, he gathered his officers. Captain Thornhill, Sergeant Vincent Ashford, a machinist from Toronto who had become the best gunner in the division, Lieutenant Donnelly, and 12 other company commanders who had spent 6 months learning how the Germans thought. "We're ordered to make noise," Blackwood said, "to be a diversion." He paused, let the words hang in the air. "I think we should do more than that." He unfolded his map on the table. The Hitler Line sprawled across it like a scar. Bunkers, artillery positions, minefields. The British had tried to break it 3 times. 847 casualties. The Americans had lost tanks. The Poles had bled. "Every attack has gone where the Germans expected," Blackwood said. "Up the valley, along the roads, through the obvious approaches." His finger traced a line to the west, through terrain marked with olive groves and tight contour lines. "What if we don't attack where they expect?" Thornhill leaned forward. "That's marked as tank-proof terrain, sir. It's marked that way because staff officers don't understand that tanks can go anywhere if you're willing to work for it. The Germans will have that covered too." "Will they?" Blackwood looked at his officers. "The Germans are brilliant at defensive warfare. They calculate fields of fire. They pre-position artillery. They mine the obvious routes. But all of that depends on knowing where you're coming from." Sergeant Ashford spoke up. He had a quiet voice, precise, like the machines he had once operated in his Toronto factory. You want to approach through the olive groves. I want to approach through terrain they think is impossible. Can our Shermans make it? I track deer through country worse than this. We'll need engineers. We'll need reconnaissance. We'll need to move at night. But yes, I think we can. Lieutenant Donnelly spread out her intelligence reports, guard schedules, rotation patterns, the gaps in German coverage. If we attack at 3:18 in the morning, she said, during their guard changeover, with tanks coming from an unexpected direction. She did not finish the sentence. She did not need to. Blackwood looked at each of his officers in turn. The British general expects us to make noise. Let's give him a breakthrough instead. The next 3 days were controlled chaos. Engineers surveyed routes through the olive groves, found paths that could support 30-ton Shermans, identified trees that needed removing, calculated angles and grades. Thornhill led reconnaissance patrols, night after night, mapping German positions, confirming Donnelly's intelligence, learning the rhythms of the enemy's routine. Blackwood drilled his tank crews, movement without lights, engine noise discipline, how to traverse turrets silently, how to coordinate infantry support without radios. Everything the textbooks said was impossible. They practiced until it became routine. On the German side, Hauptmann Bergmann noted unusual activity in his diary. May 22, 1944. Canadian sector unusually quiet. Minimal patrol activity visible. Machinery sounds at night. Possibly supply convoy activity. Von Steinberg ordered increased vigilance, but assessment remains that Canadians are not preparing major offensive. They lack strength for significant action. Main threat remains American sector. At 11:30 on the night of May 22, 67 Canadian Sherman tanks began moving through olive groves the Germans considered impassable. They moved without lights, engines throttled low, each tank following the one ahead through paths marked with stakes only the lead crews could see. Engineers had spent 3 days creating these routes, removing trees, reinforcing soft ground, building passages through terrain that every military manual said would stop armor. In the lead tank, Blackwood watched through his commander's periscope. The world was shades of grey, trees like ghosts. His driver, a 22-year-old farm boy from Saskatchewan, guided the Sherman through gaps that seemed impossibly narrow. "Easy," Blackwood said softly. "No faster." The tank inched forward. Behind them, 66 more Shermans followed. 890 infantry moved with them. No talking, no smoking, no lights. They moved like water finding cracks in stone. At 1:18 in the morning, a German patrol heard something. The patrol leader, a corporal named Werner, stopped, held up his hand. His squad froze. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. Engine sounds, distant, multiple engines. "Probably supply convoy," another soldier said. But Werner was not certain. The sound was wrong. Too many engines, and coming from the west, where the terrain was supposed to be tank-proof. "Report it," he said. The message reached von Steinberg at 1:34 in the morning. Possible vehicle movement in western sector. Grid reference. The radio operator read off coordinates. Von Steinberg looked at his map. The coordinates indicated the Olive Grove region. Impossible terrain for armor. The British had never attempted it. The Americans had never considered it. "Probably supply vehicles," he said. "But send a patrol to investigate." The patrol left at 1:42. By the time they reached the olive groves, 34 Canadian Shermans were already positioned 400 yards from the German flank, invisible in the darkness, silent, waiting. At 3:18 in the morning, exactly as Lieutenant Donnelly had predicted, the German guards changed shift. For 5 minutes, gaps appeared in their coverage. Blackwood watched through his periscope, counted down the seconds. At 3:19 and 30 seconds, he gave the order. "All units, execute!" 67 Sherman tanks erupted from the olive groves like wolves from darkness. The Germans never had a chance to react. Blackwood's tanks surged forward. The engine roared now. No more silence, speed and violence. His gunner, Sergeant Ashford, acquired the first target. a German anti-tank position that covered the valley approach, but not the flank. Never the flank, because staff officers in Berlin had marked this terrain as tank-proof. Target, anti-tank gun, 300 meters. Identified. Fire! The 75mm gun spoke. The German position disappeared in flame and smoke. Around them, the night erupted. 67 Canadian tanks firing in coordinated volleys, infantry surging forward beside them, protecting the Shermans from German Panzerfaust teams. The textbooks said infantry and armor should not advance together. Too vulnerable, too exposed. But the Canadians had practiced this for months, moving as one organism, tanks providing cover for infantry, infantry protecting tanks from close assault. In his bunker, von Steinberg heard the explosion and knew immediately what it meant. They're on our flank. How many? Unknown, Herr Major. Multiple contacts. Tank strength at least. Another explosion cut off the report. Von Steinberg moved to the observation port. Through the smoke and darkness he could see muzzle flashes. Not from the valley. Not from the expected approaches. From the west. From terrain his engineers had assured him would stop any armoured advance. Das ist unmöglich, he said quietly. Impossible. But impossible was happening. Hauptmann Bergmann appeared beside him. His face was pale in the bunker's electric light. Orders, Herr Major? Von Steinberg's mind raced through options. Redeploy forces to the flank, but that would weaken the main defences. Call for artillery support, but in the darkness and confusion they might hit their own positions. Pull back to secondary positions, but that meant abandoning fortifications they had held for 6 months. They came through the olive groves, he said, more to himself than to Bergmann. The terrain assessment was wrong. Von Steinberg turned to face his second-in-command. Or they simply did not care what our assessment said. He made his decision. Sector 4 and 5, reinforce the western flank, bring up all reserves. I want that attack stopped before they reach the highway. The orders went out. 340 German soldiers moved in the darkness, trying to redeploy, trying to counter a threat coming from a direction that should not have been possible. But Blackwood was already inside their decision cycle. While von Steinberg shifted forces west, Thornhill's infantry hit the eastern positions. While German artillery tried to range the attacking tanks, Canadian engineers blew gaps in the minefields. While German tank destroyers moved to engage the Shermans, Blackwood's column was already past them, driving toward the highway that was the real objective. At 4:38 in the morning, Canadian tanks reached Highway 6, the road to Rome. Behind them, the Hitler line was in chaos. German forces that had repulsed every Allied attack for 6 months had been outflanked, outmaneuvered, and overwhelmed, not by superior numbers or firepower, but by superior understanding of terrain and timing. The sun rose over the Leary Valley at 5:14. In that grey dawn light, von Steinberg could see maroon patches on the shoulders of soldiers consolidating positions that should have been impossible to reach. He turned to Bergmann. Send a report to division headquarters. The Hitler line has been breached. Canadian forces have reached Highway 6, requesting permission to withdraw to secondary positions. Jawohl, Herr Major. Bergmann's hand shook as he wrote the report. Not from fear, from the shock of watching months of careful defensive preparation undone in 3 hours. That night, alone in what remained of his bunker, he wrote in his diary. May 23rd, 1944. The Canadians attacked at 0318. They came through terrain we assessed as impassable for armour. They knew our guard rotation schedule. They coordinated infantry and armour with precision I have not seen from Allied forces before. They disappeared into olive groves we thought would stop them, then reappeared on our flank. They stalk, not rush. They are patient, then suddenly explosive. We underestimated them. This was our first mistake. It will not be our last. Who are these Canadians? 2 days later, when the full scope of the Canadian breakthrough became clear, the German High Command sent a team to investigate. They interviewed von Steinberg. They studied the battlefield. They examined the routes the Canadian tanks had taken. The lead investigator, a colonel from Berlin, who had never been to Italy, looked at the olive grove terrain and shook his head. No competent commander would attempt to move armor through this ground. Von Steinberg, who had lost 34 men and been forced to abandon positions he had held for 6 months, said nothing for a moment. Then he spoke quietly. "The Canadian commander is not competent, Herr Colonel. He is something far more dangerous." "And what is that?" "A hunter." The news of the breakthrough travelled fast through Allied lines. The British general who had ordered Blackwood to conduct a diversionary attack demanded a meeting. Blackwood stood in the command tent and listened to the general's congratulations. They sounded forced, as if the general could not quite believe that colonial auxiliaries had succeeded where British regulars had failed. "Extraordinary initiative, Major, quite extraordinary." "Thank you, sir. Of course, you were fortunate that the Germans were poorly prepared in that sector." Blackwood said nothing. He had learned that some officers needed to believe their own narratives. "Still," the general continued, "this opens interesting possibilities. The Gothic line to the north. That's where the Germans have concentrated their best forces. We'll need every division for that assault, including yours." "We'll be ready, sir." "Yes, well, see that you are." After the general left, Captain Thornhill appeared beside Blackwood. "He thinks it was luck," Thornhill said. "Let him think that. The men know better." Blackwood looked at his second in command. Thornhill had been with him through 6 months of preparation, through the nights of reconnaissance, through the drilling and planning and patient observation that had made the breakthrough possible. "The men know we spent 6 months learning how the Germans think," Blackwood said. "They know we studied terrain until we saw possibilities others missed. They know patience and preparation matter more than luck." "The Germans know that too now?" "Yes," Blackwood agreed, "they do." And that, Blackwood thought, was the real beginning. The Hitler line had been the test, the proof that civilian skills, hunting, forestry, observation, could translate into military success. The Gothic line would be the real challenge, a fortress that made the Hitler line look like a practice range, defended by the best units Germany had left in Italy. But Blackwood was not worried. He had tracked red deer through Scottish mountains for 20 years. He understood patience. He understood how to read terrain. He understood that the predator who waited, who watched, who struck from the unexpected angle, was the predator who survived. The Germans were about to learn that lesson again, and they would never forget it. The summer of 1944 burned hot across Italy. Highway 6 was open. Rome had fallen on June 4th, 12 days ahead of schedule. The Allied advance continued north, but every mile came slower. Every ridge cost blood. The Germans were retreating, yes, but they were not broken. They traded space for time, building defensive lines, buying days with lives. And ahead, waiting in the mountains, was the Gothic line. Major Duncan Blackwood stood on a hilltop south of Florence and studied what the Germans had built. Even from 12 miles away, he could see the fortifications carved into the Apennine ridges, bunkers that looked like natural rock formations, artillery positions hidden in valleys, a fortress that stretched across the entire width of Italy. The Hitler line had been strong. The Gothic line was something else entirely. "Intelligence estimates 300 miles of fortifications," Lieutenant Margaret Donnelly said beside him. She had lost weight since May. They all had. 6 weeks of continuous operations, fighting through every valley, every town, every river crossing between Rome and here. 300 miles, Blackwood repeated. 2,300 machine gun nests, 47,000 meters of anti-tank ditches, barbed wire that would stretch from here to Berlin if you laid it end to end. Blackwood lowered his binoculars. The numbers were staggering. But numbers were not what worried him. What worried him was the terrain. Mountains that rose nearly vertical, narrow passes that became natural kill zones, villages perched on cliffs where every building was a fortress. "The Germans have been preparing this line for 8 months, Donnelly continued. "They've had time to do it right." "What units are defending?" She consulted her notes. 1st Parachute Division, 26th Panzer Division, elements of the 98th Infantry. All veteran formations. Africa Corps survivors. Eastern Front veterans. Von Steinberg? Confirmed. He's commanding the Coriano Ridge sector. Blackwood nodded slowly. Von Steinberg, the same major who had defended the Hitler Line, the same officer who had written in his after-action report that the Canadian attack had succeeded through unconventional utilization of terrain previously assessed as unsuitable for armored operations. Military language for, they came from where we didn't expect.
He'll be expecting us to try something similar, Blackwood said. Will we?
No, he folded his map. We'll do something different. That night, Blackwood gathered his officers. The group had changed since May. 3 company commanders killed, 7 wounded, but the Corps remained. Captain Elias Thornhill, still moving with that forest ranger silence. Sergeant Vincent Ashford, who had become the best tank gunner in Italy. And new faces, who had learned quickly or died. The Gothic line is not the Hitler line, Blackwood began. Von Steinberg knows how we think now. He's seen our tactics. He'll be prepared for flanking maneuvers through difficult terrain. He spread his map on the table. Coriano Ridge dominated the center, a massive formation that controlled the approaches to Rimini and the Adriatic coast. So we don't just flank, we attack at night, when they can't see, when their advantages in position and preparation mean less. The officers exchanged glances.
Night attacks were dangerous. Coordination broke down. Friendly fire incidents increased. The Germans knew this. They relaxed their vigilance at night because they believed no sane commander would risk the chaos. The British tried night attacks at Cassino, one captain said, lost 2 companies. The British announced their attacks with artillery preparation, Blackwood replied. We won't. We'll move in complete silence. No bombardment, no warning. We'll be in their positions before they know we're coming. Captain Thornhill leaned forward. The men can do it. We've been training night movement since May. Infantry can move silently, another officer objected. Tanks cannot. Tanks can move more quietly than you think, especially if the enemy isn't listening for them. Blackwood looked at each officer in turn. Von Steinberg is one of the best defensive tacticians in the Wehrmacht. We can't outfight him conventionally, so we fight unconventionally. When? Thornhill asked. September 12th, new moon, maximum darkness.
200 miles north, in a bunker on Coriano Ridge, Major Dietrich von Steinberg received a report that made him uneasy. Canadian patrols have increased activity in our sector, Hauptmann Lucas Bergman said. They're probing our lines every night, testing responses, timing our flares. Von Steinberg studied his defensive map. Coriano Ridge was nearly perfect tactically. It rose 300 meters above the surrounding valley. Every approach was covered by interlocking fields of fire. Artillery positions on the reverse slope could rain shells on any attacking force while remaining protected from counter-battery fire. But there was always a but. The Canadians had beaten him once. They had come through terrain he thought impossible and struck where he was weakest. He would not make that mistake again. They're learning our patterns, von Steinberg said. Just like at the Hitler line.
You think they'll attempt another flanking maneuver?
I think they'll attempt something. The question is what? He had studied the Canadian breakthrough for weeks after his withdrawal from the Hitler line. Read every report, interviewed every survivor. The pattern was clear. The Canadians did not fight like other Allied units. They were patient. They prepared extensively, and they struck with sudden, overwhelming violence when the moment was right. Double the sentries after dark, von Steinberg ordered. I want flares every 30 minutes. Any unusual sound, any movement, I want it reported immediately. Jawohl, Herr Major. But von Steinberg was not satisfied. He walked to the observation port and looked out over the valley. Somewhere down there, in the darkness, the Canadians were preparing. He could feel it, the same way he had felt it at the Hitler line before the attack came. What are you planning, Major Blackwood? He said quietly.
On the night of September 12, 1944, at 2100 hours, 890 Canadian infantry began moving toward Coriano Ridge. They moved in complete silence, no talking, no smoking, no metallic sounds. Each man had taped down every piece of equipment that might clink or rattle. They moved in single file, each soldier following the man ahead. When they stopped, they froze. When they moved, they flowed like shadows. Captain Thornhill led the lead company. He had done this for 5 years in Manitoba, moving through forest at night, tracking animals that could hear a twig snap from 200 yards. The skills translated perfectly to war. Behind the infantry, 34 Sherman tanks crept forward, engines throttled to minimum RPM, tracks wrapped in cloth to muffle the sound. They moved in short bursts, 20 meters. Stop. Listen. 20 meters more. The tank commanders had their heads out of their hatches, listening to the night, feeling for any sign they had been detected. In the lead Sherman, Blackwood listened to his radio operator call off the time. 21:30 hours. They were 300 meters from the German positions. Close enough to hear German voices, close enough to smell cigarette smoke from the sentries, but not close enough yet. The plan was precise. At 02:34 hours, exactly during the German guard change that Lieutenant Donnelly had identified through weeks of observation, they would attack. Not with artillery, not with preparation, just with violence and shock. 2200 hours. Still moving, still silent. The infantry had reached 200 meters now, close enough to see the German bunkers, dark shapes against darker rock, machine gun positions that waited silently in the night. In his bunker, Lieutenant Otto Brenner stood watch, 24 years old, an engineering student before the war, now a tank gunner who had survived Africa and Sicily and 6 months of Italy. He was tired. They were all tired. But von Steinberg's orders were clear: maximum vigilance. He listened to the night, heard the usual sounds, wind through the rocks, distant artillery rumbling from other sectors, a dog barking in a village 2 miles away. Nothing unusual. At 02:34 hours, everything changed. The Canadian infantry rose from the ground like ghosts. They had been lying in wait for 3 hours, frozen, silent, waiting for the exact moment when German sentries walked back to their posts and the replacements had not yet arrived. 5 minutes, Lieutenant Donnelly had said. 5 minutes when they're vulnerable. She was right. The Canadians covered the last 200 meters in a rush. No shooting yet. Bayonets and grenades. They wanted to be inside the German positions before the alarm could be raised. They wanted confusion, chaos, terror in the dark. Brenner heard the sound first. Footsteps, running. Too many footsteps. "Alarm!" he shouted. But the alarm was too late. Canadian infantry poured over the first line of German positions like water over a dam. Hand-to-hand fighting in the darkness, the flash of grenades, screams, German soldiers stumbling from bunkers to find enemies already inside their perimeter. And then the Shermans appeared. 34 tanks that had crept to within 150 meters without being detected. Now they opened fire. Muzzle flashes lit up the night like strobe lights. The 75mm guns spoke in sequence. Methodical, professional. Each tank commander selecting targets. Each gunner firing with the precision Sergeant Ashford had drilled into them for months. Blackwood's tank fired at a German anti-tank position. The bunker disappeared in flame. His loader had the next round chambered before the smoke cleared. His gunner traversed to the next target. Fired. Loaded. Fired again. Around them, chaos. But inside Blackwood's tank, there was only calm efficiency. This was what they had practiced. This was what they had prepared for. Target, bunker, 11 o'clock. Identified. Fire. Von Steinberg was in the command bunker when the attack began. He felt the first explosions through the rock, grabbed his helmet, ran to the observation post. What he saw shocked him. The Canadians were already inside his first line of defense. Infantry fighting in his trenches. Tanks firing from positions that should have been covered by his sentries. How had they gotten so close? How had 800 men and 34 tanks approached to within rifle range without being detected? All units engage, he ordered. Artillery, fire pre-registered defensive fires. The German response was swift. Artillery shells began falling on the approaches to Coriano Ridge. Machine guns opened up. Flares burst overhead, turning night into stuttering daylight. But the Canadians were already inside the flare perimeter, already in positions where German artillery could not reach without hitting their own troops. Hauptmann Bergmann appeared beside von Steinberg. His face was pale. "How many?" von Steinberg asked. "Unknown. Multiple companies. Tank strength at least 30 vehicles. They're everywhere, Herr Major. Everywhere. That word again, just like at the Hitler line. Von Steinberg made rapid calculations. The Canadians had achieved total surprise. They held the initiative. His defensive positions were designed to stop attackers approaching from the valley, not enemies already inside his lines. "Pull back to the secondary positions," he ordered. "We cannot hold here." It was the right tactical decision, but it felt like defeat. The fighting continued until dawn. By 06:12 hours, when the sun rose over Coriano Ridge, the Canadians held the crest. Behind them, scattered across 600 meters of mountainside, lay the evidence of the night's work. Destroyed German positions, abandoned equipment, and 34 white crosses marking Canadian graves. Blackwood stood at the summit and looked north. More mountains, more ridges. The Gothic line stretched as far as he could see. Coriano Ridge was just one position, one victory. Ahead lay weeks more of this grinding advance. Captain Thornhill appeared beside him. His uniform was torn, blood on his sleeve from a grazing wound he had not mentioned. "We lost 34 men," Thornhill said quietly. 34 more families, 34 more telegrams. The cost of victory measured in lives that could not be replaced. "The Germans lost at least 90, Blackwood replied. "Not as justification, just as fact." Von Steinberg retreated again. "He's learning. Every time we fight him, he learns. Next time will be harder." "Will there be a next time?" Blackwood nodded toward the northern ridges. "The Gothic line has another 100 positions like this one. Von Steinberg will be at one of them, and he'll be ready." That night, Hauptmann Bergmann wrote in his diary by candlelight in a bunker 5 miles behind Coriano Ridge. September 13th, 1944. The Canadians attacked at 02:34. They came in complete silence. We did not know they were there until they were already inside our positions. I have fought in Africa. I have fought in Sicily. I have never seen anything like this. They moved like ghosts. No artillery preparation, no warning, just sudden violence in the darkness. We only heard them when they were ready to kill. Von Steinberg says they are learning how we think, then doing the opposite. He is right. These are not colonial auxiliaries. These are hunters who treat war as their craft. The Canadians pressed north. September became October. October became November. Each ridge took days or weeks to secure. The Gothic line was not a single fortress. It was hundreds of positions, each one defended, each one costly. But patterns emerged. The Germans began to recognize Canadian tactics, the patience, the extensive reconnaissance, the attacks from unexpected directions, and something else, something that frightened German soldiers more than artillery or tanks. The Canadians always came back. A German machine gunner would pin down a Canadian attack, watch them retreat under fire, breathe relief. And then, 2 hours later, sometimes 4 hours later, the Canadians would return. Same position, same quiet determination, as if the previous attack had never happened. Lieutenant Brenner experienced this firsthand at Rimini in October. His tank had repulsed 3 Canadian probes. Each time, the Shermans had withdrawn after taking fire. Each time, Brenner had thought that was the end of it. The 4th time, at 18:47 hours, as the light was failing, he saw movement again. "Panzer," he said tiredly to his commander. "Here they come again." The Canadian Shermans advanced with that same methodical pace, not rushing, not hesitating, just rolling forward as if defeat and withdrawal were merely temporary setbacks. Brenner's gun fired, hit. A Canadian Sherman shuddered to a stop, smoke pouring from its engine deck. The crew bailed out, ran for cover. But the other Shermans kept coming. One got within 280 meters, dangerously close, the range where a Sherman's 75mm gun could penetrate German armor, where the Sherman's weakness in armor penetration mattered less because everything was vulnerable at close range. Brenner's commander shouted, "Reverse! Get us back!" But before they could move, the Canadian Sherman fired. The round hit their track. Not a killing blow, but crippling. The Panzer lurched to a stop, immobile. and the Canadian Sherman was still advancing. "Abandon tank!" the commander ordered. They bailed out, ran. Behind them, another Canadian round hit where they had been sitting 10 seconds before. That night, safe in a bunker 2 miles back, Brenner tried to explain to a new replacement what it felt like to fight Canadians. "They are not like the others," he said. "The Americans come with power. The British come with method. But the Canadians, they come with patience. You hurt them, they leave. You think you have won, then they come back. Always they come back. You can delay them, but you cannot stop them." The replacement, a boy of 17 who looked 14, asked, "Are they good soldiers?" Brenner thought about that, remembered the Sherman that had closed to killing range, remembered how the Canadian tank commanders exposed themselves in their hatches to get better visibility, even though it made them vulnerable to snipers, remembered the infantry who moved with forest silence, the coordination between tanks and foot soldiers that was better than anything he had seen in the Wehrmacht. "They are excellent soldiers," he said finally, "and that is why we are losing." The days grew shorter. The rain came. The mountains turned grey and hostile. But the Canadians kept advancing, ridge by ridge, position by position. The Gothic line that was supposed to be impregnable was being taken apart piece by piece, not through overwhelming force, not through superior equipment, but through patience and persistence and the refusal to accept that impossible meant impossible. In early November, von Steinberg stood in a command bunker and studied casualty reports. His division had started the Gothic line defense with 340 men. Now, he had 187. The mathematics were brutal. Every week, another 20 or 30 casualties. Replacements arrived younger and less trained. "How long can we hold?" Bergman asked. Von Steinberg did not answer immediately. He looked at his map, the Canadian advances marked in red, each mark representing days of fighting, each mark representing German positions abandoned. "As long as we must," he said finally, "but not as long as we would like. The Canadians are different from other Allied forces. Yes. They adapt faster, they learn our patterns, and they—" Bergman paused. "They never seem to tire." Von Steinberg nodded. This was what worried him most. Not Canadian tactics, not their equipment, but their morale. After months of fighting, after thousands of casualties, the Canadians still attacked with the same determination they had shown at the Hitler line. German soldiers, by contrast, were exhausted, low on supplies, low on hope. They fought well because they were professionals, but there was a difference between fighting well and fighting with conviction. The Canadians fought with conviction. How do they maintain such morale? Bergman wondered aloud. Because they believe they will win, von Steinberg said. And belief, Hauptmann, is more powerful than any weapon we possess. By mid-November, the pattern was clear. The Gothic line was collapsing. Not through one dramatic breakthrough, but through hundreds of small victories. Each ridge taken, each position abandoned. The Germans were not routed, but they were retreating. And everywhere, German soldiers told the same stories, about men with maroon patches who appeared from impossible angles, who attacked when they should have been exhausted, who came back after being driven off, who fought with a calm, methodical determination that wore down even veteran units. Von Steinberg began planning the next withdrawal, to the Po River, the last major natural barrier in northern Italy. If the Canadians broke through there, the war in Italy would be over. But that was a problem for later. For now, he had to manage an orderly retreat, preserve as many men as possible, delay the Canadians without wasting lives in hopeless last stands. War, he told Bergman one night, is about choosing which defeats are acceptable. In late November, as winter settled over the mountains, the tempo of fighting slowed. Both sides were exhausted. The Canadians consolidated their positions, the Germans retreated to defensive lines further north. A pause, not peace, but a breathing space before the next round. Blackwood used the time to visit his units. He walked through tank parks where mechanics worked on damaged Shermans. He stopped at aid stations where wounded soldiers recovered. He spoke with company commanders about casualties and replacements, and the condition of their men. Everywhere he went, he saw the same thing: exhaustion, the kind that sleep could not fix, the kind that came from months of continuous combat. "How are the men holding up?" he asked Thornhill one afternoon. "They're tired, sir, but they're holding." "Morale?" "Good. They know they're winning. They can see the Germans retreating. That matters." Blackwood nodded. Morale was fragile. It could break suddenly if men lost faith in their leadership or their cause. He worked hard to maintain it, made sure the men knew their sacrifices mattered, made sure they understood that every position taken brought the end of the war closer. But sometimes, late at night, he wondered if it was enough. 800 miles away, in a field hospital in Florence, Sergeant Vincent Ashford recovered from wounds he had taken during the final assault on the Gothic line. Shrapnel from a German artillery round. Nothing life-threatening, but enough to earn him a trip home. Lieutenant Donnelly visited him before he was evacuated. "You're going home," she said. "So they tell me." "What will you do?" Ashford looked at his hands, a machinist's hands, hands that had loaded thousands of rounds into a Sherman's 75mm gun. Hands that trembled now when he tried to hold a coffee cup. "Go back to Toronto. Find a factory job. Try to forget." "Will you?" "Forget?" He smiled without humor. "No, but I'll try." She sat beside his bed. They had known each other for 18 months, through training in England, through the landing at Salerno, through every battle since. "We did something important," she said. "The Gothic line was supposed to be impregnable. We broke it." "At what cost?" She did not answer immediately, because the answer was written in the casualty lists. Thousands of Canadian casualties since landing in Italy, from a division that had numbered 12,400. "Was it worth it?" Ashford asked. "We stopped the Germans. We helped end the war. Whether that was worth the lives we spent..." She paused. "That's not a question I can answer." Major Blackwood thinks it was. Major Blackwood carries every one of those casualties with him. I see it in his eyes. Ashford nodded. He had seen it too. The way Blackwood walked through the tank park after a battle, touching each damaged Sherman, remembering the crews. The weight of command measured in lives spent and lives saved. "He's a good officer," Ashford said. "The best I've served under. But good officers suffer for their decisions, and he has made many decisions that cost lives to save lives. The moral calculus of war. Attack here and lose 30 men, or attack somewhere else and lose 300. Both choices bought with blood, both choices leaving ghosts." They were quiet for a moment. Then Ashford said, "Tell him something for me." "What?" "Tell him his decisions were right. Tell him we knew the risks. Tell him we chose to follow him because we believed in what he was doing." Donnelly nodded. "I will. And tell him..." Ashford paused. "Tell him to finish this. End the war. Make all these casualties mean something." "He will. He's planning the Po River offensive now." "Then the war really is almost over?" "Yes, almost." Ashford was evacuated to England 3 days later. He would survive the war, return to Toronto, try to rebuild a life from the fragments war had left him. But he would never forget Italy. Never forget the men he had served with. Never forget the sound of a 75mm gun firing, or the smell of cordite, or the sight of maroon patches advancing through impossible terrain. Some things soldiers carried forever. By December 1944, the Gothic line was history. The Germans were north of the Po River. The Canadians were consolidated in the Apennine foothills. Winter set in. Fighting slowed. Both sides dug in. But the war was not over. Not yet. One more spring offensive waited. One more campaign. And the Canadians, those men with maroon patches, those hunters and foresters and farmers who had become soldiers, would be there for it. Major Blackwood spent Christmas 1944 in a farmhouse outside Rimini. He wrote letters home, read reports, studied maps of the Po Valley, planning for spring. Captain Thornhill found him there on December 25th at 1800 hours. "Merry Christmas, sir." "Merry Christmas, Captain. The men are asking if you'll join them for dinner." Blackwood looked at his maps. at the red lines marking German positions, at the blue lines showing where Canadian forces would advance when spring came. So much still to do, so many decisions still to make. But the men were asking. He stood, folded his maps. Lead the way. The dinner was held in a barn, rations supplemented with whatever the soldiers had scrounged. It was not much, but they made it festive. Someone had found a bottle of wine. Another man played harmonica. They sang. They told stories. They tried very hard not to think about the friends who were not there. Blackwood stood and raised his tin cup. "To absent friends," he said. "Absent friends," they echoed. And in that moment, in that barn in Italy on Christmas 1944, they were not soldiers. They were just men, trying to survive, trying to do their duty, trying to hold on to whatever humanity war had not yet taken from them. Outside, snow began to fall, soft and white and silent, covering the scars of battle, hiding the evidence of violence. For a few hours at least, there was peace. But morning would come, orders would arrive, and the war would continue. Because wars do not pause for holidays or hope. They grind forward until someone wins, or someone surrenders, or everyone is too exhausted to continue. The Gothic line had fallen, but the Germans still held northern Italy, and Major Duncan Blackwood, the hunter from the Scottish Highlands who had become a soldier, knew that the hardest fighting was still ahead. The Po River waited. 20 miles of open ground, 3 bridges that could be blown at any moment, German forces desperate and dangerous, the final barrier before Austria and Germany itself. Blackwood studied his maps every night, planned, calculated, searched for advantages, the same way he had studied terrain in the Scottish Highlands, the same way he had found the route through the olive groves at the Hitler line, the same way he had planned the night assault on Coriano Ridge. War was problem-solving, and every problem had a solution if you were patient enough to find it. "What are you thinking?" Thornhill asked one evening, finding Blackwood alone with his maps. "That the Germans will defend the Po River with everything they have left. Can we break through?" "Yes, but not the way they expect." Thornhill smiled. He had heard that before. "What way then?" "Speed, surprise, anticipation." Blackwood traced a line on the map. "The Germans will expect us to wait for the spring offensive, to attack with overwhelming force, artillery preparation, coordinated assault. And we won't? We'll move before they're ready, strike while they're still withdrawing, take the bridges before they can blow them. That's risky. Everything in war is risky. The question is whether the risk is worth the potential gain." Thornhill looked at the map, at the Po River, at the distances and terrain and the complexity of what Blackwood was suggesting. "The men will follow you," he said. "You know that." "I know. That's what frightens me. They trust me to make the right decisions, to spend their lives wisely, and I'm not always sure I deserve that trust." "You've earned it, every time." Blackwood did not reply. He just looked at his maps, at the red lines and blue lines, and all the calculations that would turn into orders, that would turn into action, that would cost lives. Command was burden, and he would carry it until the war ended, or he fell. Outside, the snow continued to fall. Winter deepened, the war slept, but only for a moment, only until spring, only until the Po River offensive that would decide whether Italy's war ended quickly or dragged on for months more. Blackwood returned to his letters, to his reports, to his maps. The work never stopped, could not stop, not while men depended on him, not while the war continued, not while Germans still held ground that needed to be taken. The Gothic line had fallen, but the war was not over, not yet. February 1945. The Po Valley stretched flat and white under winter snow. Major Duncan Blackwood stood at a crossroads and watched German refugees streaming north. Old men, women, children. They pushed carts loaded with everything they owned. They did not look at the Canadian soldiers. They just walked, faces hollow, eyes empty. This was what the end of war looked like. Not glory, not triumph, just exhaustion and displacement and the grinding weight of defeat. "Sir." Captain Elias Thornhill appeared beside him. The captain had aged 10 years in 18 months. Lines around his eyes that had not been there at Salerno, grey in his hair that was new. War left marks on everyone. "Intelligence reports German forces are pulling back across the Po River," Thornhill said. "They're trying to establish a new defensive line north of the water." Blackwood studied his map. The Po River was the last major natural barrier in northern Italy. Once the Allies crossed it, the road to Austria and Germany itself lay open. The Germans knew this. They would defend that river with everything they had left. How many bridges are still standing? 3, but they're all mined, ready to blow on command. Then we have to get there before they blow them. It was February 18th, 1945. The spring offensive was scheduled for April. But Blackwood had learned something in 18 months of fighting. War did not wait for schedules. Opportunities appeared, disappeared. You took them or you lost them. "Assemble the company commanders," he said. "We move tonight." That decision would save hundreds of lives, maybe thousands. But Blackwood did not know that yet. He only knew that the Germans were retreating. That retreat created vulnerability, and vulnerability created opportunity. 20 miles north, Major Dietrich von Steinberg supervised the withdrawal of his remaining forces. He was 43 years old. He looked 60. The war had consumed him. Africa, Sicily, Italy, 18 months of fighting retreat, watching positions fall, watching men die, watching the inevitable conclusion approach like a slow tide. "How many men do we have left?" he asked Hauptmann Lucas Bergmann. Bergmann consulted his roster. His hands shook slightly. They all shook now. Fatigue and strain and the constant knowledge that they were losing. 134 effectives, Herr Major. Another 47 walking wounded. 12 seriously wounded who cannot move. From 340 to 134. The mathematics of attrition. Every battle took men. Replacements came younger and less trained. The cycle spiraled downward. And the Canadians? Reports indicate they are preparing for spring offensive. No immediate threat detected. Von Steinberg was not so certain. He had fought the Canadians for 18 months. He knew how they thought. They were patient. But when opportunity appeared, they struck with sudden violence. And this withdrawal, this retreat across the Po River, was nothing but opportunity. "Increase rearguard patrols," he ordered. "I want warning if they move before we're across the river." "Jawohl, Herr Major." But the warning would come too late. At 0200 hours on February 19th, Canadian forces began moving north. They moved with the silence Blackwood had drilled into them. No lights, engines throttled low, infantry in the lead, clearing routes for the armor following behind. They moved fast, faster than the Germans expected, faster than even Allied command thought possible. Because Blackwood was not following doctrine, he was following instinct. The same instinct that had told him when a stag was about to bolt, when prey was vulnerable. The Germans were vulnerable now. By 0600 hours, Canadian reconnaissance had reached the southern approaches to the Po River. They could see German engineers preparing demolitions on the bridges, laying charges, wiring detonators, getting ready to blow the crossings and trap the Allied advance for weeks. Lieutenant Margaret Donnelly radioed the position back to Blackwood. 3 bridges, all mined, German engineers working, heavy security. How long until they're ready to blow them? Estimate 4 to 6 hours. Blackwood checked his watch. 0614 hours. If the bridges went down, the spring offensive would be delayed. Thousands more casualties, weeks more war. We take the bridges before they blow them. It was insane. A daylight attack across open ground against prepared positions. Everything military doctrine said not to do. But doctrine was written by men who had never hunted deer through Scottish Highlands, who had never learned that sometimes the impossible was the only option that worked. "All units," Blackwood broadcast. "We attack at 0700 hours. Objective, capture the Po River bridges intact." The assault began 46 minutes later. 34 Canadian Shermans emerged from morning fog like iron ghosts. Behind them, 800 infantry moved in practiced coordination. They had done this so many times now, tank and infantry attacks. the choreography of violence. The German defenders were caught in the worst possible position. Half their force was across the river, half was still on the southern bank. The engineers were exposed at the bridges, and the Canadians were coming fast. Von Steinberg saw the attack develop from his command post north of the river, saw the Shermans breaking through his screening forces, saw his rear guard collapsing, saw everything he had feared.
"Blow the bridges," he ordered into his radio. But the engineers were already dead or fleeing. The detonation charges sat unconnected, useless, and Canadian tanks were rolling across all three bridges. Hauptmann Bergmann stood beside von Steinberg and watched their defensive line disintegrate. "They anticipated our withdrawal," he said quietly. "They knew where we would go. They knew when we would be vulnerable." "Yes." "How?" Von Steinberg thought of the Canadian major, the hunter, the man who had spent 18 months learning how Germans thought, learning their patterns, learning to anticipate their moves. "Because they hunt," von Steinberg said, "and they know where prey runs before prey knows itself." By 1100 hours, all three bridges were in Canadian hands. The Po River crossing that should have delayed the Allied advance by weeks was completed in one morning, at a cost of 23 Canadian casualties, against an estimated 300 German losses, including prisoners. The mathematics of preparation versus improvisation, of anticipation versus reaction. Blackwood stood on the northern bank of the Po River and watched German forces retreating further north. They were broken now, not just tactically, psychologically. They had nowhere left to retreat, no more rivers to defend, no more mountains to fortify. The war in Italy was ending. That realization hit him harder than he expected. Relief, exhaustion, and guilt, because he had survived and so many had not. Captain Thornhill appeared beside him. "Orders from division, sir. We're to hold position here. Let other units pass through for the final advance into Austria." "We're done?" "We're done." 18 months. From Salerno to the Po River, through the Hitler line, through the Gothic line, through hundreds of small battles whose names nobody would remember. Done. "How many did we lose?" Blackwood asked. Thornhill had the numbers memorized. Every commander did. The cost of command measured in lives. 4,511 casualties, 1,273 killed, the rest wounded, missing or captured. From 12,400 to effectively 8,000. 1 in 3. The price of victory in Italy. "Make sure division knows," Blackwood said quietly. "Every name, every man. I want them recorded properly." "Yes, sir." 10 days later, on February 28, 1945, the war brought Duncan Blackwood and Dietrich von Steinberg face to face for the first time. Von Steinberg's remaining forces had been cut off near Verona, surrounded. No ammunition, no supplies, no hope. At 13:47 hours, after conferring with his officers, von Steinberg made the decision he had known was coming since the Po River fell. "We surrender," he told Bergmann. "Get white flags. I will not waste men's lives for a cause already lost." 134 men laid down their weapons. They were searched, processed, directed toward a POW collection point in a field that had once grown wheat, but now grew only mud and the detritus of war. Von Steinberg stood with his officers, waiting. A Canadian lieutenant approached. "Major von Steinberg?" "Yes." "Major Blackwood wishes to speak with you, sir. This way." They walked through the Canadian positions. Von Steinberg noted the organization, the discipline, the quiet efficiency. These were not soldiers celebrating victory. These were professionals concluding business. Blackwood stood beside a Sherman tank. He was reading a map. When he looked up, von Steinberg saw eyes that carried the same weight he felt. The weight of command, the burden of decisions measured in lives. "Major von Steinberg," Blackwood said in accented but clear German. "Major Blackwood." Von Steinberg had learned the Canadian commander's name months ago, had studied his tactics, had tried to counter his moves. "You speak German?" "A little. My mother was from Hamburg." They stood in the February cold, breath visible in the air. Around them, German prisoners and Canadian guards,
but between them, something different. Not hatred, not triumph, just two professional soldiers who understood what war cost. "You fought well," Blackwood said. "Not well enough. Well enough to cost us a lot of good men." Von Steinberg looked at the Canadian major, tried to reconcile the image with reality. This was not a professional military man. This was a hunter who had been handed an army and discovered that the skills translated. "At the Hitler line," von Steinberg said, "you came through the olive groves, through terrain we assessed as impassable for armor. You learn something hunting deer. They don't go where you expect, they find the gaps. You hunted deer. Scottish Highlands, 20 years before the war." Von Steinberg almost laughed. The Wehrmacht's defensive positions in Italy, positions designed by professional officers with decades of military education, had been beaten by a man who tracked deer. "And Coriano Ridge?" he asked. "How did you approach so close without detection?" "Wolves hunt at night. They move silently. Wait for the moment their prey is vulnerable. You treat war as hunting. I treat war as problem-solving, and terrain is terrain, whether you're tracking a stag through the highlands or anticipating a retreat across the Po River." Von Steinberg was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I studied your breakthrough at the Hitler line for weeks, read every report, interviewed every survivor. The pattern was clear. You are patient, you prepare extensively, and you strike with overwhelming violence when the moment is right. You adapted quickly. Every battle after the Hitler line was harder. But still, we lost, because you kept coming back. That is what broke us. Not your tactics, your persistence." Blackwood nodded. "Persistence is all we had. We were the smallest Allied division in Italy. We had to make every attack count. You succeeded, more than succeeded." Von Steinberg extended his hand. "I am grateful that when I lost to worthy opponents." Blackwood shook it. The handshake of professionals who understood war's demands, even if they disagreed on war's causes. "War doesn't have to destroy honor," Blackwood said. "No, but it often does. You maintained yours, that matters." Von Steinberg was led away to the POW collection point. That night, in a tent with 30 other German officers, he wrote in his diary for what would be the last time as a soldier. February 28, 1945. "I surrendered to Canadian forces today, met Major Blackwood, a hunter, not a soldier by training, yet he defeated me through superior understanding of terrain and timing. The Canadians were extraordinary opponents. They fought with skill, courage, and honor. If we had to lose in Italy, I am grateful we lost to men like these. The war here is over. What comes next, I do not know. But I know this, I fought against remarkable soldiers, and in the end, that is something." The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. Major Blackwood heard the news in a farmhouse outside Milan. VE Day. Victory in Europe. Celebrations erupted across the Allied lines. Men who had not smiled in months, suddenly laughing, crying, embracing. Blackwood walked outside, away from the noise. He stood in a field and looked at the mountains where he had spent 18 months. Mountains that held graves. Mountains that would never forget what happened there. Captain Thornhill found him. "It's over, sir." "Yes." "We won." "Yes." "Why don't you look happy?" Blackwood turned to face his second-in-command, the man who had been with him since Salerno, who had led night patrols through terrain that maps said was impossible, who had survived when so many had not. "Because winning cost more than I thought it would," Blackwood said. "We saved lives by ending it sooner." "Maybe, but I keep thinking about the lives we spent to get here." Thornhill was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You did everything right, sir. You used terrain, you trained us well, you anticipated enemy moves, you saved more lives than you spent." "Did I? How do you measure that? How do you know that my decisions were worth what they cost?" "You don't. You can't. You just have to trust that you did your best with what you knew. And if my best wasn't good enough, then you live with it, like every commander in every war since Alexander. The weight of command, the burden that came with making decisions that spent lives to save lives. Blackwood had known it intellectually, but feeling it was different. Feeling it was carrying names with you everywhere you went. "What will you do?" Blackwood asked. "When we go home?" "Forest ranger again, I suppose." "Manitoba needs men who know how to work in wilderness." "Peaceful work?" "Yes, sir, very peaceful." They stood together in the Italian spring, two soldiers who would soon be civilians, who would try to forget, who would fail to forget, who would carry Italy with them for whatever years remained. In July 1945, the 5th Canadian Armoured Division sailed for home. They left from Naples, the same port where many had first seen Italy 18 months before. But they were not the same men who had landed. They had been tested, hardened, changed in ways they would spend decades understanding. Duncan Blackwood returned to Scotland in August 1945. He was 40 years old. He looked 50. Isabel met him at the train station in Cairngorms. They stood on the platform and looked at each other. 2 years apart. He had written letters. She had written back. But letters could not convey what war did to a man. "Welcome home," she said. He embraced her, held on, felt tears he had not allowed himself to feel in Italy. The release of survival. The guilt of survival. The impossible mixture of relief and shame. "I'm home," he said. "Yes, you're home." He returned to work as a forest ranger, the Scottish Highlands where he had learned to hunt, where he had learned patience and observation and how to read terrain, skills that had made him a good soldier, skills that would let him be a civilian again. But the transition was hard. He woke at night hearing artillery, saw faces of men who had not come home, remembered decisions that had cost lives. Isabel would find him standing at the window at 3 a.m, staring at darkness, living in memories he could not escape. "Talk to me," she said one night. "I can't." "Why not?" "Because you weren't there. Because words can't explain what it was like. Because I'm afraid if I start talking about it, I won't be able to stop." She took his hand. "Then don't talk. Just know I'm here." He wrote a memoir. Not for publication, just for himself. An attempt to understand what had happened. What he had done. Whether it had been worth it. The memoir sat in a drawer for 30 years. He could not bring himself to share it, could not face the judgment of others, could only live with his own judgment, which was harsh enough. Elias Thornhill returned to Manitoba in 1945, became a forest ranger again. The work he had done before the war, the work that made sense. Trees did not shoot back. Animals did not lay mines. The forest was dangerous, yes, but its dangers were honest. He never married, never talked about why. People assumed it was the war. They were right. He had seen too much death to risk loving someone who might be taken away. But he was not alone. He mentored young veterans, helped them adjust, taught them that survival had many forms, that living after war was its own kind of battle, that the forest could heal if you let it. "Does it get easier?" the young veteran asked him in 1952, a boy who had fought in Korea, who had the same haunted eyes Thornhill saw in his mirror. "No," Thornhill said honestly, "but you get stronger, and strength is enough." He died in 2006, 90 years old, peacefully, in the forest he loved. They found him sitting against a tree, looking at the sky, gone without struggle. Those who knew him said it was the death he would have wanted. Quiet, dignified, at peace with the land that had saved him. Sergeant Vincent Ashford returned to Toronto in December 1945. The shrapnel wound had healed, the physical damage repaired. But his hands still shook when he tried to hold a coffee cup, still trembled when loud noises startled him back to Italy. He found work in a factory, the same work he had done before the war, operating machines, precision work. His hands learned to be steady again, muscle memory overcoming trauma. He married in 1947, a woman named Dorothy who worked as a nurse. She understood trauma, had seen it in hospitals, did not push him to talk, just gave him space to heal. They had 3 children. Ashford taught them to work with their hands, to value precision, to understand that doing something well was its own reward. He never told them about loading Sherman guns, never described the sound a 75mm made when it fired, never mentioned the smell of burning tanks. On November 11th each year, he would stand in the cold and think of 34 men whose names he could still recite from memory. Dorothy would stand beside him, silent, supportive, understanding without needing to understand. He lived to be 73. Heart attack in 1991. Quick. The doctor said he did not suffer. His children, going through his effects, found a box of letters. Letters from men he had served with. Letters from families of men who had died. Letters he had never mentioned. They read them and finally understood who their father had been.
Lieutenant Margaret Donnelly stayed in the military after the war. Rare for a woman in 1945, but her intelligence work had been too valuable. The Canadian Army needed people who could analyze patterns, who could think strategically, who could turn information into action. She rose to the rank of colonel, worked in military intelligence through the Cold War, applied the same meticulous attention to detail she had used studying German Guard rotations to studying Soviet troop movements. She never married, never had children. When asked why, she said simply, "I had my duty." She retired in 1975, wrote classified reports that would not be declassified for 50 years, lived quietly in Ottawa, died in 1998, 78 years old, pneumonia. Her obituary in the newspaper was 3 lines. It did not mention Italy, did not mention the intelligence work that had saved hundreds of lives, did not mention that she had been one of the few women in combat intelligence in World War II. But the veterans who attended her funeral knew, and they made sure her grave marker told the truth. Lieutenant Margaret Donnelly, Intelligence Officer, 5th Canadian Armoured Division, 1943 to 1945. Her work saved lives. In Germany, the defeated were also rebuilding. Dietrich von Steinberg spent 2 years in prisoner of war camps, first in Italy, then in England. The camps were not pleasant, but they were not brutal. The British and Canadians treated their prisoners according to Geneva Convention rules. He was released in 1947, returned to Munich. The city was rubble. His university was damaged, his home destroyed in bombing. His wife had survived. His children were grown. His country was occupied and divided, but they were rebuilding. Germany was rebuilding, and they needed teachers. He returned to his position as professor of military history at the University of Munich. But now he taught with different perspective. War was not abstract theory. It was mud and blood and decisions made in darkness. It was brilliance and stupidity mixed together. It was human. His students, many of them veterans, recognized the change. This was not a professor lecturing from books. This was a man teaching from scars. "War is not glorious," he told his class in 1950. "War is necessary sometimes, but never glorious. Remember that." Lucas Bergman rebuilt his journalism career after the war. Berliner Zeitung was gone, destroyed, but journalism survived. West Germany needed honest reporters, men who could tell truth after years of propaganda. Bergman specialized in reconciliation stories, German-Jewish reconciliation, German-Allied reconciliation, stories about healing, about moving forward, about choosing hope over hatred. In 1980, he published excerpts from his wartime diary, the entries about Canadians, the observations about their tactics, the growing respect that had developed even in conflict. The book sold well in Canada. Veterans recognized themselves in Bergman's descriptions, recognized the truth in enemy observations. Some wrote to him, letters that began hostile but ended friendly. The slow work of reconciliation. Bergman visited Canada 5 times between 1982 and 2008, met veterans, shared stories, built bridges between men who had tried to kill each other. He died in 2011, 104 years old, the oldest surviving war correspondent from World War II. His funeral was attended by Canadian and German veterans, old men who remembered, who honored a man who had chosen truth over propaganda. Lieutenant Otto Brenner, the young tank gunner who had learned to fear Canadian persistence, survived the war as a prisoner, captured at Rimini, spent 3 years in a Canadian POW camp in Ontario, learned English, learned that his captors were not monsters, just men
who had fought as hard as he had. He returned to Germany in 1948, finished his engineering degree, worked in reconstruction. Hello, rebuild what war had destroyed. He never spoke about the war, except to say he had served. But in 1995, on the 50th anniversary of VE Day, he wrote a letter to a German newspaper. In it, he described the Canadians, their persistence, their honor, their refusal to break. They were worthy enemies, he wrote, and in losing to them, we lost to men who deserved victory. The letter was translated and published in Canadian newspapers. A small act of reconciliation, a bridge built with words. In 1972, Dietrich von Steinberg published a book that would change how both sides remembered the war. Die Maroon Maschine. The Maroon Machine. It was a military analysis of Canadian tactics in Italy, written with academic rigor, detailed, precise, but also written with respect, with admiration, with the honesty that only defeat could bring. Von Steinberg analyzed the Hitler Line breakthrough, the Gothic Line campaign, the Po River crossing. He described Canadian patience, their unconventional use of terrain, their coordination between infantry and armor, their persistence that wore down superior German defensive positions. But more than tactics, he wrote about character, about how the Canadians had treated prisoners, about their honor even in war's darkest moments, about the humanity that survived conflict. The final chapter was titled Lessons from Defeat. In it, von Steinberg wrote, "The Canadians were worthy enemies. They fought with skill and courage. They won not through superior numbers or equipment, but through superior thinking. They adapted to terrain. They anticipated our moves. They persisted when others would have stopped. If we had to lose in Italy, I am grateful we lost to men like these. War teaches many lessons. The hardest lesson is that your enemy is human. The Canadians never let us forget that. And for that, paradoxically, I am grateful." The book was translated into English in 1974, published in Canada and the United States. It reached Duncan Blackwood in Scotland. Blackwood read it slowly over 3 days, carefully, seeing his war through enemy eyes. Von Steinberg wrote about battles Blackwood remembered, described tactics Blackwood had planned, analyzed decisions Blackwood had made in darkness and doubt. But von Steinberg wrote with fairness, with honesty, more honesty than Blackwood had expected from a defeated enemy. On the last page, Blackwood sat quietly. Then he did something he had not done in 30 years. He wrote about the war. "Dear Major von Steinberg," the letter began, "I have read your book. It is honest and fair, more fair perhaps than we deserved. I want you to know that we held you in equal respect. You defended brilliantly. You made us earn every meter of ground. You adapted to our tactics faster than we anticipated, and when you surrendered, you did so with dignity that honored both sides. If circumstances were different, I think we could have been friends. Perhaps now, 30 years later, we can be. War made us enemies. Peace should make us something better. I would be honored to meet you someday, to speak not as soldiers but as old men who survived, to remember not just what divided us, but what we shared. With respect, Duncan Blackwood." He mailed the letter to the publisher, hoped it would reach von Steinberg, hoped the gesture would mean something. 3 months later, a reply arrived. "Dear Major Blackwood, your letter moved me deeply, more than I can express in words. Yes, in different circumstances we could have been friends. Perhaps we can be now. War made us enemies, but war is over. What remains is memory. And memory, if we choose, can build rather than destroy. I would be honored to meet you, to shake the hand of a man I respected even when we were trying to kill each other, to prove that enemies can become something more. I am old now, 74. My traveling days are limited. But if you would welcome me, I would come to Scotland, to see the land that taught you to hunt, to understand where you learned the skills that defeated me. With respect and hope for friendship, Dietrich von Steinberg." They corresponded for 7 years. Letters about war, about peace, about the weight of command, about survival's guilt, about finding meaning in what they had done. And in 1985, von Steinberg traveled to Scotland. He was 85 years old. Blackwood was 80. They met at the Cairngorms train station on a cold October morning. Two old men who had not seen each other in 40 years, who had spent 18 months trying to kill each other, who now embraced like brothers. "You look well," von Steinberg said. "You look old," Blackwood replied with a smile. "We are old, but we are alive, and that, my friend, is victory enough." Blackwood took von Steinberg into the highlands, showed him the country where he had learned to hunt, the terrain that had taught him patience, the mountains that had prepared him for Italy. They walked slowly, old men's pace, stopping frequently, not from fatigue, though they were tired, but from the need to talk, to remember, to finally speak truths they had carried for 40 years. "This is where I learned to track deer," Blackwood said, pointing to a valley. "My father taught me. Patience," he said, "never rush. The deer will show you where to go if you watch long enough." "And you applied that to war?" "I applied it to survival, mine and my men's." They stood on a ridge overlooking terrain similar to Italy. Mountains, valleys, difficult ground. "Do you regret it?" von Steinberg asked. "The war, what you did." Blackwood was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I regret that war happened. I regret every man who died, but I don't regret how I fought. I tried to win with minimum casualties. I tried to use intelligence rather than just power. I tried to be honorable." 30 years of sitting unread. They read it and wept. Then they decided it should be published. Patience Under Fire appeared in 1995, 6 years after Blackwood's death. It became a bestseller among military history readers, not because of tactics, but because of honesty. Blackwood had written, "I was not a professional soldier. I was a hunter who became a soldier. I applied hunting skills to war. Patience, observation, understanding terrain, anticipating movement. These skills saved lives. Not all the lives, but some, and some is better than none. I carry the names of those who died. I will carry them until I die. That is the price of command, and it is right that I should pay it." In 2024, 79 years after the end of World War II, a memorial was dedicated in Cassino, Italy. Joint Canadian-German monument, funded by both countries, designed by descendants of men who fought there. The ceremony was small, dignified. No politicians, just families. Duncan Blackwood's grandson attended. He is a forest ranger in British Columbia, carries on his grandfather's profession, learned the same patience, the same observation skills. He has never been to war, hopes he never will be. Dietrich von Steinberg's granddaughter attended. She is a professor of history at the University of Munich, teaches the same courses her grandfather taught, but with his later philosophy, war as tragedy, peace as triumph. They met at the memorial, shook hands. Two young people connected by grandfathers who tried to kill each other, who failed, who survived, who found respect in war and friendship in peace. "Your grandfather was a great man," she said. "So was yours," he replied. They laid wreaths together, Canadian and German flags side by side. And on the memorial, words that both grandfathers would have approved. Die Verfluchten, / the cursed ones, / who earned our respect in memory of all who fought and all who fell, 1943 to 1945. The inscription below read simply, "Former enemies forever. Brothers, in memory of sacrifice." 3 lessons endure from the 5th Canadian Armoured Division's war in Italy. First, unconventional thinking defeats conventional preparation. Duncan Blackwood was a hunter, not a professional soldier. That made him see possibilities career officers missed. The deer paths through Scottish Highlands translated to tank routes through Italian olive groves. The patience learned stalking prey translated to waiting for enemy vulnerabilities. War rewards those who think differently, not just those who think well. Second, persistence overcomes position. The Germans had superior defensive positions, better terrain, months of preparation. But the Canadians kept coming back. After every repulse, they returned. After every casualty, they persisted. The Germans called them Die Verfluchten, not because they were cruel, but because they were everywhere, because they refused to accept defeat. In the end, position means nothing against an enemy who will not stop. Third, honor survives conflict. Duncan Blackwood and Dietrich von Steinberg spent 18 months trying to kill each other. But when war ended, they chose friendship over hatred, respect over resentment, understanding over anger. That choice, repeated by thousands of veterans on both sides, proved that humanity survives war if we choose to preserve it. The maroon patches are in museums now. The Shermans are silent. The mountains of Italy are peaceful. The veterans are mostly gone. But the story remains. A story of 12,400 men who fought with skill and honor, who won through intelligence rather than just power, who treated enemies as humans rather than targets, who proved that small forces with superior thinking can defeat larger forces with conventional tactics, and who showed, in the end, that enemies can become friends if both sides choose to remember what they shared rather than what divided them. That is the legacy of the Maroon Machine. Not victory, not defeat, but the demonstration that even in war's darkness, character matters, honor matters, humanity matters. And those lessons, written in Italian soil with blood from both sides, endure across 80 years and will endure as long as we choose to remember them.